Welcome to our deep dive into JavaScript, specifically for you, the learner. You shared this pretty substantial resource, JavaScript Notes for Professionals. And today we're going to try to pull out the insights, the things you really need to know about variables and data types and strings and built-in constants.
Yeah, and this is going to be like your shortcut to understanding some of these fundamental pieces of JavaScript without having to read through the whole thing.
Exactly. And we've got a lot of different chapters and sections here, everything from the basics of JavaScript syntax to some pretty advanced concepts.
Yeah.
But we're going to focus on, I think, some of the most fundamental building blocks here.
Right.
So let's start with variables.
Variables.
Variables are the containers for holding information in JavaScript.
Right.
And you define them using that keyword var, followed by whatever you want to call the variable, the name of the variable.
Right.
And then optionally, you can assign it a value.
Right. And what's interesting about variables in JavaScript is they can hold a lot of different types of data. We're talking about things like integers and longs, which are whole numbers. Floats and doubles,
Right.
which are numbers with decimal points.
Right.
Booleans, true or false values.
Right.
And then also some special values like nan, which stands for not a number,
Right.
and undefined, which signifies a variable that's been declared but hasn't yet been given a value.
And I think it's interesting that nan is actually considered a number type,
Right.
even though it represents something that's not a number.
Yeah, and that's one of those kind of JavaScript quirks that can trip people up.
Oh, yeah.
It's in your notes, so now you know.
Right.
Another kind of quirky thing is that if you divide by 0 in JavaScript, you don't get an error like you might in some other programming languages.
Right.
Instead, you get infinity or S infinity.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it makes sense, but,
Yeah.
you know, it's not necessarily intuitive.
Right.
The resource also talks about null, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Null represents the intentional absence of a value. It's different than undefined, which just means that a variable hasn't been assigned a value yet.
Right.
Null means we're specifically saying there's nothing here.
Yeah, you're explicitly assigning the absence of a value.
Exactly. And the funny thing is the type of null in JavaScript is actually object.
Right. It is.
Yeah.
Which is a little bit strange, but
Very strange.
important to know.
Very important to know. And again, like I think these are these little things that early on in JavaScript, if you don't kind of internalize them, they can really trip you up later.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about understanding those subtle differences.
Right.
So let's move on to strings.
Yeah, strings. So strings are just sequences of characters. And in JavaScript, you can enclose them in single quote, double quotes, or backticks.
Right. And those backticks are what we call template literals.
Right.
And they have some additional features that can be really useful.
Right. They let you embed variables and stuff right into the string without having to do a bunch of concatenation.
Exactly.
So yeah, you can combine strings using the plus operator.
Right.
Or you can use the concat method.
Yeah. There's a little kind of trick that you'll often see where people reverse a string using split and then join.
Oh, yeah.
But it's worth noting that that may not always work perfectly with all characters,
Oh, really?
particularly some of the characters that are outside of what we call the basic multilingual plane. So that would be like certain emojis or other special characters.
Interesting.
It's because they're represented by more than one code point. And that simple reversal can sometimes, kind of break them apart.
So that's like a little gotcha
Yeah, exactly.
you have to look out for.
Something to be aware of.
And then when you're comparing strings alphabetically, using just the greater than or less than operators might not always give you what you expect, especially when you're working with different languages.
Yeah, for sure.
The resource highlights the use of local compare
Right.
as a more reliable way to do that kind of comparison.
Exactly.
You can also access individual characters within a string or you can use the bracket notation as if it was an array.
Right. Treat it like an array.
Yeah, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, and that raises an important point for the learner.
Okay.
Like, how consistently do we need to be thinking about these different ways of working with strings?
Right.
All right, so let's move on to built-in constants in JavaScript.
Yeah, built-in constants. So these are values that are always available in JavaScript.
Right, so we've already talked about a couple of them, like null, nan, and undefined.
Right.
There's also infinity and asinfinity.
Right.
The resource points out the difference between the in function and the number is nan function.
Oh, yeah.
And the newer one, number.isNan, is a more precise way of checking if a value is specifically nan.
Right.
Without first trying to convert it to a number.
Right, because the old isNan function would do that type coercion, which could be unexpected.
Yeah.
And the number object also provides you with some other really useful constants like number.mx value, which is the largest representable positive number in JavaScript.
Right.
And then conversely, number.mn value, which is the smallest.
Exactly. And then we also have number.maxoff integer.
Right.
And number.minsoff integer, which represent the range of integers that JavaScript can handle with complete accuracy.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we've covered a lot of really good ground here today. The learner, you've provided us with this great starting point, and I think we've pulled out some really interesting insights.
We've talked about the different types of variables and data types that you encounter in JavaScript, how to work with strings,
right,
and then these really important built-in constants.
Right.
So null, undefined, nan, infinity.
right.
Understanding these core elements of JavaScript is really crucial because
I think this is the big takeaway for me. Like, these are the foundations for literally everything you do.
exactly. Once you have a solid grasp on these basic building blocks,
Right.
everything else starts to make a lot more sense.
Yeah. So the learner, now that you have this foundational knowledge,
Right.
what does this change about the way that you approach debugging JavaScript code?
Right. How does it change the way that you think about how other people's JavaScript code works?
Yeah, it's definitely something to consider as you continue down your path.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thanks for listening to our deep dive into JavaScript.
See you next time.
See ya.